Good morning. Welcome to Rising. We have a big show for you today. Happy Friday, Ryan.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, today on Rising, we have Oren Cass. He's going to weigh in on big tech policy. The founder of the Daily Poster, David Sirota, also joins us to discuss Tom Perez exploring a run for governor in Maryland.
We also have two all-star panels for you that you won't want to miss. But first, Dr. Anthony Fauci says his emails are being misconstrued and had this to say when asked if he would do anything differently.
Let's get real here. If you look at scientific information as it accumulates, what is going on in January and February, what you know as a fact, as data, guides what you tell people and your policies. If March, April, May occur, you accumulate a lot more information and you modify and adjust your opinion and your recommendation based on the current science and current data. So of course, if we knew back then that a substantial amount of transmission was asymptomatic people, if we knew then that the data show that masks outside of a hospital setting are actually do work when we didn't know it then.
Okay, so if what Fauci just said is true,
right,
that actually seems quite reasonable. You go with the best information you have at the time you have it. As you accumulate more information, that might change your idea of what the best practice is going forward, and then you honestly communicate that new information to the public. That seems reasonable, right?
Sure, but that is a very big if.
That is a huge if. Let's find out if that was true. Let's go to a trusted source, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
What about a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying, you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who you know were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed.
Okay, those two clips back to back, in my opinion, is all you need to know about the integrity of Anthony Fauci, because while he is making the rounds on television shows, and except for when he had to reschedule on us, I should add, while he's making the rounds, he is also like this sanctimonious posturing, we're doing what we can, blah, 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 blah. He said two different things here. One, both of those things cannot be true. And that's, to me, the crux of all of the issues that all of the hot water that he's in right now. Those two things from those two clips can't be true. And so while the media likes to, just absolutely lavish him in praise and say the integrity of Anthony Fauci, all you need to know is in those two clips.
And you could even maybe make an argument. I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, but you could make some type of utilitarian argument that there are moments when public health officials, can't be completely honest to avoid a panic or something else with or from the public. Let's say that you can acknowledge. Let's say that there are possible scenarios where that's the case. Let's even say, just for the sake of argument, that this was a situation where he really didn't want to run on masks, and so he had to lie, he had to mislead the public about whether or not masks were useful to them so that healthcare workers could have them. All right, let's say that's true. He publicly said that he misled the public a year ago.
Right.
Yet now, in the wake of his emails coming out, he's pretending as if we don't remember that.
Yeah.
We don't have video of him saying that at the time. And now he's saying, as he said in that first clip, well, we didn't have all the information.
Yeah.
We didn't know about asymptomatic transmission. We didn't know that masks work outside the hospital setting as well as inside the hospital setting because we didn't have the data. And look, I'm not a virologist. I'm not a scientist. What on earth is magical about the walls of a hospital?
Right.
That would render a mask effective inside those walls, but the walls of a Walmart suddenly render a mask ineffective.
Ryan, I am a virologist.
Oh, okay, good.
But what he said in that original email to Sylvia Burwell, which we talked about yesterday, was that the virus, the droplets are too small, that they are able to pass through a mask. And that's in his original email. And I don't know if he would change that today. And I think I agree completely with you. The point of all of this is that how can you expect to have any trust in your public officials when the public face of the federal government's coronavirus response said, first of all, that he made this noble lie, and then came back and is now actually trying to undermine his own, it's like a noble lie about the noble lie. It's so outrageous. And I agree with you that if he had just been consistent and said, listen, we lied because we thought it was in the public's best interest, I think that would still be outrageous, but it would be consistent and it wouldn't continue to chip away at public trust in institutions in the way that he's doing right now, which I don't think he understands the ramifications of at all.
Right. Own your noble lie.
Yeah.
Like if it's noble, own the nobility of it. Instead, the new lie is totally ignoble. Mm-hmm. And so Jen Psaki was asked whether this ignobility has affected his standing at the White House. Here's what Jen Psaki had to say.
Has anyone from your team briefed the president on what was in those FOIA Fauci emails?
I'm not aware of him being briefed on the publicly reported emails.
And then, given that there were some things that Fauci said privately that contrasted with what he said publicly, whether it was masks or whether or not someone who had the virus, had immunity, or other questions as well. I mean, does he still have confidence in his NIH director? Does this change anything at all?
No, the president and the administration feel that Dr. Fauci has played an incredible role in getting the pandemic under control, being a voice to the public throughout the course of this pandemic. And again, I would reiterate, a lot of these emails are from 17 months ago or more, certainly predating this administration, but some time ago.
So what you heard there was a frequent member of Team Rising, that was the voice of Philip Wegman, who I think asked a really good question. And given what we just discussed, that 1 and 2, those two clips back to back, in addition to other things that Dr. Fauci has said and what we know from his email with Sylvia Burwell, do you think, Ryan, that it's time for the White House to just permanently sort of like stuff Fauci in a closet and like get him to stop speaking in public because he just keeps getting them deeper and deeper into a hole?
I do, but the reason I think that they won't do it is because then in their minds it would be validating all of the people that they consider to be the worst actors over this last year. And in fact, it would. You would have a lot of fringe weirdos that would celebrate and say, like, look, Fauci has been exposed. Therefore, everything I said was true, even though, let's say, 10% of what they said was true, and some of that would be by luck. And it plays into this kind of bifurcated truth that we now have, where if you are critical of the other side, then you are therefore assumed to be supporting the other side of them. And if you concede anything at all, then you are conceding everything.
It's like the lab leak. It's the same thing. It's
like if you acknowledge that we don't have enough evidence either way, then all of a sudden you're right.
Right, and if you're right, that is so true, and it's a great example of how the politicization of everything is making us less efficient and less, on top of all of this stuff as a country. I guess from the White House's perspective, the public response that Fauci continues to give has been bad. But what worries me is sort of like the private things that he's actually in control of, that he's the levers that he is actually in control of in government, that, we don't even know what decisions are being made behind the scenes right now, and I just think his clear, character lapses over the course of the last year, which are coming into clearer focus every day, make me a little bit nervous about that.
And Fauci in 2012, and we talked about this yesterday on the show, in 2012 he wrote a paper saying that the public health community needs to acknowledge the legitimate criticisms from the public and from skeptics of their research, that gain of function research, that where you make a virus more dangerous and more infectious so that you can study it and come up with defenses against it, that there's some conceivable risk that could leak out and cause a pandemic. And he said we need to take seriously the fact that we have conflicts of interest when we're making our arguments, because we are the ones that are doing this research. And so, therefore, obviously, we're more sympathetic to it than the public might be. That was what Fauci said quite soberly in 2012. He now has conflicts all over the place. I'm not talking about financial conflicts, but just intellectual and scientific conflicts where he is invested in particular positions that may or may not be right, and that we as a global community need to hash out, because we as a global community are the ones who are affected by their screw-ups if they happen.
And it's always easy for people to sit back and sort of Monday morning quarterback the response to something as incredibly difficult as a pandemic. I mean, nobody is saying these decisions were easy, but we're now more than a year into this thing. And Anthony Fauci, I think, continues to make the situation worse. I think he continues to be worse in his response, at least publicly, from what we can see as the face of the federal government's response. I don't think it's getting any better. And I think, we've all had time to sort of reflect. And at this point, I don't understand why we're now telling noble lies about the noble lies. Speaking of the federal government's response, former CDC Director Robert Redfield says he received death threats after embracing the lab leak theory. And while we still don't know the origin of the coronavirus, NIH Director Dr. Francis Collins, he says it's time to move on.
We all agree that it's very important to put COVID behind us. You and I have talked about vaccines, we've talked about research, but now more and more, I think it's really important that we drill down, because we don't want this to happen again. And we have seen other viruses that came from lab leaks. I think that is also something that wasn't widely discussed at the beginning of this. So I think there are a lot of questions about the relationships and why we weren't asking tougher questions early on from our medical professionals.
I agree we need to get to the bottom of this, but gosh, you and I just spent a whole bunch of minutes here talking about some issue that we need to get an answer to, and meanwhile people are still dying from COVID-19, and we didn't even talk about the ways to get to an end to this with vaccines. So please, could we have a bit more of the focus on how we're going to save lives while we're talking about how this all started? We need both of those, don't we?
That is an outrageous display of arrogance, in my opinion, from Francis Collins, because we were just talking about this yesterday, Ryan. We didn't earn, a 2-year break from potential pandemics. We didn't even earn a 2-month break from potential pandemics. We have no idea what could be coming out next. And the point is drilling down into our relationships with China, what we're funding in general, period, and how these things start is a huge step towards mitigating the risks for the future. So Francis Collins' suggestion that this is something that can be sort of hashed out later and is not immediately important to mitigating the pandemic right now is ridiculous and actually kind of frightening.
And when people say, can we talk about both things? What they actually mean is, can we only talk about this one thing? Mm-hmm. They don't. Okay, fine, let's talk about both things. And so in this segment, we are talking about this one thing. There is an enormous amount of coverage on treatment and on the vaccines. And fine, we should absolutely acknowledge the vaccines have worked miraculously to push down the numbers where countries have been able to vaccinate a significant amount of their population. You look at states that are 50, 60, 70% vaccinated, you're seeing cases plummet. That's terrific. That's wonderful. And we should talk about that. We do talk about that. We've talked about the research that has led up to these vaccines, which is taking a pandemic that in 1919, it was lasting well into 1920, killing more than 20 million people at a time when the global population was a fraction of what it is now. So great, we can talk about all that. That's not an excuse to say, does it really matter how it started? Do we really need to probe so deeply into whether it came from a leak in a lab? And all we're saying, and all we're saying journalists ought to be doing is asking questions until we have either arrived at an answer or we have turned over every rock looking for every potential answer. There's research that went on in North Carolina, as Fauci talked about in his emails. We should be looking at that. If there are any other leads, those should be explored. But the idea that we just shouldn't talk about it at all because we ought to be talking about both things just doesn't square.
No, and another good example is Fauci has always, I think, struggled, and a lot of people in our federal government have struggled to talk about the World Health Organization and to talk about China, because these are difficult, because the United States is sort of inextricably intertwined with some of these really nefarious organizations and the Chinese Communist Party in uncomfortable ways. And so I just think there's, if anything, I would call the need to understand the origin of this pandemic urgent, let alone like Francis Collins sort of like sighing theatrically in exhaustion. So that's a disappointing clip, to say the least.
Right, exactly. And in 2012, as we were talking about, Fauci had endorsed a pause on this type of research while we could figure out the safety of it and do the cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't seem that it should be off the table to discuss the kind of thing that Fauci himself was talking about back then. We will have more Rising for you after this.